Primary adrenal insufficiency, also known as Addison's disease, is a rare endocrine disorder that happens when the adrenal gland isn't able to produce enough of the hormones that the body needs, particularly aldosterone and cortisol. The reason it's called primary is that the underlying problems localize to the adrenal gland itself, rather than a problem of a hormone that acts on the adrenal gland or elsewhere in the body. Primary adrenal insufficiency can develop acutely or chronically, and a really famous example of someone having this condition is John F. Kennedy, who was diagnosed at age 30. Now, there are two adrenal glands, one above each kidney, and each one has an inner layer called the medulla and an outer layer called the cortex, which is subdivided into three more layers: the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. The outermost layer is the zona glomerulosa, and it's full of cells that make the hormone aldosterone. Aldosterone is part of a hormone family, or axis, which work together and are called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Together, these hormones decrease potassium levels, increase sodium levels, and increase blood volume and blood pressure. Aldosterone is secreted in response to elevated levels of renin, and its role is to bind to receptors on two types of cells along the distal convoluted tubule of the nephron. First, it stimulates the sodium-potassium ion pumps of the principal cells to work even harder. These pumps drive potassium from the blood into the cells, and from there it flows down its concentration gradient into the tubule to be excreted as urine. At the same time, the pumps drive sodium in the opposite direction, from the cell into the blood, which allows more sodium to flow from the tubule into the cell, down its concentration gradient. Since water often flows with sodium through a process of osmosis, water also moves into the blood, which increases blood volume and therefore blood pressure. The other function of aldosterone is to stimulate the proton ATPase pumps in alpha intercalated cells, which causes more protons to get excreted into the urine. Meanwhile, ion exchangers on the basal surface of the cell move the negatively charged bicarbonate ion into the extracellular space, causing an increase in pH. The middle layer of the adrenal gland is the zona fasciculata, and the cells there make the hormone cortisol, as well as other glucocorticoids. Cortisol is needed in times of emotional and physical stress, like arguing with a friend or fleeing from a pack of raccoons. In those situations, the hypothalamus, which is an almond-sized structure that sits at the base of the brain, releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, which is then received by the pituitary gland, the pea-sized structure sitting just under the hypothalamus. In response, the pituitary gland sends out adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, which travels through the blood to the zona fasciculata of the adrenal glands, and signals cells there to release cortisol. Cortisol is a lipid-soluble molecule, meaning it can mingle with fats, which allows it to easily pass through the plasma membrane of cells and bind to the receptors inside. In fact, almost every cell in the body has cortisol receptors, so it affects a huge variety of functions in the body. One of cortisol's main jobs, though, is to increase blood glucose levels by promoting gluconeogenesis in the liver. Gluconeogenesis is the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, like amino acids or free fatty acids. Cortisol also gets the muscles to break down proteins into amino acids and gets adipose tissues to break down fats into free fatty acids, both of which help provide the liver with more raw materials to work with. So basically, cortisol keeps blood glucose levels high, and this is in contrast to the hormone insulin, which causes glucose to be taken up by various body tissues. And so essentially, cortisol acts to counteract this effect in an effort to make sure that the body can respond appropriately to those raccoons or other stressors. Finally, the innermost layer is the zona reticularis, and the cells there make a group of sex hormones called androgens, including one called dihydroepiandrosterone, which is the precursor of testosterone. So the adrenal glands are involved in testosterone production in both men and women, but the amount that the adrenal glands actually contribute is pretty small, relative to the testes in men, which account for the very different levels of androgens in men versus women. In men, high levels of androgens are responsible for the development of male reproductive tissues and secondary sex characteristics like facial hair and a large larynx, or Adam's apple. In women, low levels of testosterone are responsible for a growth spurt in development, underarm and pubic hair during puberty, and an increased sex drive in adulthood. The exact mechanism for adrenal androgen production isn't well understood, but like cortisol, it seems to be stimulated by adrenocorticotropic hormone released from the pituitary gland. So that all brings us back to primary adrenal insufficiency, which is where the adrenal cortex gets progressively damaged over time. In developed countries, the most common cause is autoimmune destruction, when the body's own immune cells mistakenly attack the healthy adrenal cortical tissues, though the exact reason why this happens isn't clear. In developing countries, the most common cause is tuberculosis. In this case, the infection spreads from the lungs to the adrenal glands, causing inflammation and destruction of the adrenal cortex. Another important cause is metastatic carcinoma, which is where cancer spreads to the adrenal cortex from somewhere else in the body. Regardless of the cause, it turns out that the adrenal cortex has a high functional reserve, meaning that a small amount of functional tissue can still do a pretty good job of churning out enough hormones to meet the body's needs. As a result of this, though, once there are symptoms, it's usually a sign that a majority, sometimes up to 90%, of the adrenal cortex has been destroyed. The symptoms of primary adrenal insufficiency correspond to which layers of the adrenal cortex have been destroyed. When the zona glomerulosa is destroyed, aldosterone levels fall, and that leads to high potassium levels in the blood, or hyperkalemia, and low sodium levels in the blood, or hyponatremia. With less sodium around in the blood, water moves out of the blood vessels, which results in a low blood volume, or hypovolemia. Finally, fewer protons are lost, meaning more build up in the blood, and that results in an acidosis, and more specifically a metabolic acidosis, since it's caused by the kidneys. These electrolyte changes in hypovolemia can cause symptoms like cravings for salty foods with simultaneous nausea and vomiting, fatigue, and dizziness that worsens with standing. When the zona fasciculata is destroyed, cortisol levels fall, and that leads to inadequate glucose levels during times of stress. This means that while being chased by a pack of raccoons, instead of feeling ready to sprint, a person might feel weak, tired, and disoriented. Also, those decreased levels of cortisol cause the pituitary gland to become overactive, since usually cortisol has a negative feedback effect on the pituitary gland. So it ends up producing pro-opiomelanocortin, which is a precursor to adrenocorticotropic hormone, but it also turns out to be a precursor to melanocyte-stimulating hormone, the hormone that leads to skin pigment production. So when your pituitary gland's overactive, it ends up making more melanocyte-stimulating hormone, resulting in hyperpigmentation, or darkening of the skin, especially in sun-exposed areas and joints, like the elbows, knees, and knuckles. In some extreme cases of primary adrenal insufficiency, the zona reticularis can be affected as well, and androgen levels can fall. This decrease doesn't affect men much, because remember that the testes are a major source of male androgens. Women, though, can experience a loss of pubic and armpit hair, as well as a decreased sex drive. Oftentimes, the slowly progressive chronic symptoms of primary adrenal insufficiency are missed or ignored until a major stressor, like a serious injury, surgery, or infection, suddenly causes the symptoms to become really severe. In other words, the body has a sudden increase in the need for aldosterone and cortisol, and the failing adrenal cortex simply can't deliver. This is known as Addisonian crisis, or acute primary adrenal insufficiency, and it usually happens when the majority of zona glomerulosa and zona fasciculata are destroyed. It can cause a sudden pain in the lower back, abdomen, or legs, with severe vomiting and diarrhea, followed by dehydration, low blood pressure, and loss of consciousness. Left untreated, an Addisonian crisis can be fatal. Addisonian crises can also come about from Waterhouse-Friderichsen syndrome, which is when a sudden increase in blood pressure causes the blood vessels in the adrenal cortex to rupture, filling up the adrenal glands with blood and causing tissue ischemia and adrenal gland failure. Primary adrenal insufficiency can be diagnosed with an adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulation test. During the test, a small amount of synthetic adrenocorticotropic hormone is given, and the amount of cortisol and aldosterone produced in response is measured. And this helps you figure out how well the adrenal glands are working. Usually, individuals with primary adrenal insufficiency are treated with hormones to make up for the lack of cortisol, aldosterone, and androgens. They typically have to be taken for the rest of an individual's life, and stopping the hormone replacements can lead to Addisonian crisis. Alright, as a quick recap, primary adrenal insufficiency is a failure of the adrenal cortex, specifically the zona glomerulosa, which causes low aldosterone, as well as the zona fasciculata, which causes low cortisol, and in severe cases, the zona reticularis, which causes low androgens. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Hope you liked that one. It was a beast, so huge thanks goes to Caitlin for writing the script and Rishi for editing the script. They both put a ton of time into it, and I think it turned out pretty good. So as always, you can help support us by donating on Patreon and subscribing to our channel, as well as telling your friends about us on social media. All right, see you guys.